Okay, so it's very weird only seeing myself. So I encourage everybody to, throw up those questions as we go through. I teach for a living, so I'm okay with being interrupted and continuing the conversation with you guys. So thank you to Dan, Allison, and Vina for inviting me to come and speak today. If you guys can take a minute in the chat, just let me know what schools you're from so that I have an idea of how broadly this is being broadcasted right now. Great. So UC Davis, I see here, RPI, welcome. Cal Arts, nice. University of Edinburgh. That's wonderful. So you guys will see as we go through the talk today that my background is definitely going to flavor this webinar. I am a lover of microbes, though I think that microbes are both overhyped and undersold. So I think there's a contradiction there. We'll talk a little bit about their importance in biodesign. Actually, we'll talk a lot about their importance in biodesign today. But just a little bit more background before we launch in today. I do co-teach a course in biodesign here at the University of Pennsylvania, and Orkan Telhan, who co-teaches it with me, is in the School of Design. So it's truly an interdisciplinary collaboration. I'm frozen. Oh no, I think I'm okay. Dan and Allison, is everything okay? Okay, great. So we co-teach this course, and it started when Orkan came and asked me for some lab space. At that point, I was only teaching pre-med students and students who were majoring in bioengineering, so I wasn't really dialed into the biodesign world, though my background in microbial ecology always had me interested in applied microbiology. I just hadn't thought about it through the lens of product design. And so when he started teaching and bringing students in, probably some like you guys, fine arts students, design majors, it really opened up my eyes to how the life sciences could be used and what a poor job we were doing in science education and including you guys in the conversation, and really just how important it is for a whole diversity of people to be working together to take the knowledge that scientists are building and actually develop them into applications that can reach consumers directly and that can be scaled by industrial partners. And so now I have a much more holistic view of how the process works. And this is a really exciting time. You guys all know we're in the emerging area of biodesign. So I'm sitting here virtually with the future designers, the future biologists, who are going to make real impacts. But there's a lot of work to be done, whether it's coming up with new knowledge, coming up with new applications, or even completely, oh yes, and engineers, or completely redeveloping the infrastructure that exists. If we are going to start producing things and manufacturing using biology, we have a real challenge ahead of ourselves in terms of how we're going to scale our applications. So I hope to touch on all of that today. I'm going to take you through some background, and then we're going to jump into a case study to look at how I teach biodesign with my students and how we make our way through iterations for prototypes and how we really think about the implications of our designs. So without much ado, I will get started. So what you're seeing here on the first slide is one of the very first activities we do with the students, which is we bring in a whole bunch of different microbes, a whole bunch of different media, so nutrients that they can grow on. And we do this in a very traditional way where we take a petri dish. So this media has agar added to it to solidify it. And we let the students paint with it. And the really nice thing here is that some of this media, these nutrients, will create different phenotypes in the organisms depending on their metabolisms, so how they can actually use the nutrients. And so I hand the students a book so that they can think about the species they're working with and the nutrients in front of them and what the predicted outcome should be. And then they make these beautiful designs. So it's their first chance to really think about how you integrate what you feed organisms with how you can control the expression in a way that's desirable to you. And so I always kind of step back when I'm talking about biodesign and just really try to marvel at the diversity of life that's out there. So I think I would have loved to be an ecologist in the 1960s and be a naturalist, travel through the Amazon, be on massive voyages, just looking and finding out what organisms are out there. So I encourage all of you who are getting into this field to take some time to just read about organisms and understand all of the different appearances they have, the different morphologies they have, and then all of the different functions they have. So a really good resource for this is the Planet Earth series. How many of you watch that? So a bunch of you, Nancy says she does. And so when it's raining and you need a break from studying, go on Netflix, look up the Planet Earth series, and there's just so much information there. And you can dive in by biomes, you can dive in by organisms, and you just get a real appreciation for how all of life is trying to solve some major problems. And let me see, I thought my arrow down here. And so life has to figure out how to get nutrients. It has to figure out how to grow in response to those nutrients. It has to figure out how to compete with other organisms to actually get those nutrients. Then it has to figure out how to find a mate and reproduce so that the species doesn't go extinct. It has to worry about things trying to eat it, so predators. It has to figure out how to get water, right? It has to know where to find oxygen if it needs oxygen. So there's a lot of problems that we all have to solve every single day, whether or not we realize it. And we can see that play out in a bunch of diverse responses. So if you look at just the animal kingdom, and that previous graphic I showed you right here is mostly animals, plants and animals, right? There might be a little insect here. There's no microbes on here that I can see. But what you see is that there's something like 10 to 30 million species of animals. And most animals, when we think about diversity, are actually insects. And so if you have the chance, I'm looking on my shelf here to see if I have a good insect book. I keep just field guides around because you can look through and understand what organisms do just by, rifling through a field guide there. And so insects are amazing. We had a biodesign challenge group 2 years ago submit a project around spiders and how to build communal spider webs, which was thought to not be possible, but actually through their research and collaborating with some scientists at the Smithsonian, they were able to figure out how they could get these spiders to build massive, massive webs. And of course, plants have a ton of diversity. Plants, I think, are one of the most undervalued organisms to look at. And that's because people find plant biology to be boring, which just means they have a really bad teacher because plants are really badass. They're awesome. They have to solve all of those things. Allison and Dan say, boo. No, absolutely not. Plants are amazing. Plants have to solve all of life's challenges without moving. So that's a pretty tall order. And when you look at a lot of the ways that plants solve life's problems, you can find all kinds of crazy adaptations that really make plants as successful as they are. So I encourage people to find their inner plant geek and start to understand that diversity. But I'm a microbial ecologist by training, and so I think that the coolest diversity out there and the diversity that's dominated on life is held by microbes. So something like 10 million to a billion species of microbes exist. This is a tremendous amount of diversity. We don't actually know a lot about this diversity. And we're only starting to figure out a lot of what the function is that's subscribed to these different species. And so this is a really huge area. It feels a bit like we're Darwin on the Beagle at the moment. So instead of being out on these large ships taking water samples or heading to the Galapagos to understand diversity, we're going out and we're collecting soil, or we're collecting swab samples of our urban environment and we're extracting the DNA and realizing that there is way more out there than we could ever see, and that diversity is really important to animal health, environmental health, and human health. So I love to strike the narrative of germs. Yes, there are bad microbes, just like there's bad animals, and I use that in quotes because the organisms are just trying to survive and have adapted to their situation. But the majority of what's out there is either beneficial or neutral and holds a lot of secrets that we could take advantage of in the design world. And so no matter where we look, we find microbes, right? So we even find them on the space station. So we find microbes everywhere. And if you would love to travel with your job, becoming a microbial ecologist is a great way to do that. You can't see them, but they make up a tremendous amount of the biomass on Earth. So 50% of biomass on Earth is estimated to be microbial. That means that most of the biomass we can't see. It's living on us, it's living in us, it's living around us. As we move into urban environments where we over-sterilize, we actually get rid of a lot of this biomass. Probably that's detrimental to our health in certain ways. We're trying to understand that in the field. So estimates are that, for every cell you have, there's either 1 to 10 bacterial cells. So as you guys study for your exams, as you work through the biodesign challenge, try not to stress. Remember, you're just a host for your microbes. That's the whole point of your life. Of course, not really, but I like to keep that in perspective. So when you're out in the environment, grab, a scoop of water, grab a scoop of sand, and really just reflect for a moment at how many organisms are in there and the diversity of functions that they're performing. So when we think of organisms in general, microbes in particular, we like to understand kind of what drives their numbers and drives who's present where. And most of it comes down to the physical and chemical conditions of the environment, as well as the other organisms that are living there. And so as you're thinking about your designs and you're thinking about incorporating biology, one of the things that you have to think about in the design process is, what does this organism need to thrive? And if I don't put that into the environment, will that kill my design, or will it just arrest it from growing? There may be times where you just want to stop things and you don't want to kill the organism. And so there are strategies for doing that. For example, when we grow things with bacteria, instead of adding antibiotics, which may kill the organisms, we can simply put them into the refrigerator, cool them down, and they'll stop growing. And we can hold them there for 3 weeks or so. So you want to think about that kind of range of adaptations that organisms have so that you can leverage that in your design. So we think about, resources. What do they need for food? Things like carbon, nitrogen. If you get serious and are working in biodesign as a career, you're probably going to need to do some work in ecosystem ecology to understand nutrient cycles, not, in a boring way, but just really understanding how carbon flows through a system, for example. Who's taking up carbon dioxide, who's producing carbon dioxide, who needs organic carbon, who can work off of inorganic carbon. So we think about these things and just try to get a handle of, where these different organisms exist so that we can play off those adaptations in our designs. Micronutrients, vitamins are really important for organisms, and so having some understanding of that's important. Temperature is something we care about, what the amount of water and humidity that they need, under what ranges of pH can they survive. How about light, right? So there's some organisms that absolutely need light. So our photosynthesizers, our plants, our algae, they need light. But too much light can be detrimental depending on what they're adapted to. Other organisms don't like light at all. And light, in fact, can be really, can have a really negative impact on how they grow. And so the bottom line is, you guys can go out, you can watch things like Planet Earth, you can pick up books about the diversity of life, and you can become a repository with these facts. But there's just too much to know. There's just absolutely too much information. And the beautiful thing is we live in the information age, and most of this information is available to you at your fingertips if you know where to look. And so as you guys are coming up with your designs, don't hinder yourselves by the organism. Instead, be very visionary and very bold with your design. And then seek out the organism that can help you complete that design. And then really think about the ethics of bringing that organism in. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But if there's a problem you're trying to solve, the takeaway message is that life has solved it. And you are trying to figure out which life has solved it. And so think about these things. Think about, what food they need, what conditions they're living in, and who else in their environment, what other organisms might be really key for them to be able to grow. I don't actually have that highlighted here on a slide, but ecologies, so groups of organisms, communities of organisms, can be really important to the function of your design. You may not actually be able to elicit a response from an organism unless you have another organism in the environment, especially when we're talking about microbes. Some of the more sophisticated and complex metabolisms, if you're starting with a feedstock and you want some end product, might actually take you putting together two organisms that live in very different parts of the world or very different environments, but bringing them together in a new relationship so that you can actually achieve that end goal. So thinking about the biological factors is also important. Okay. So if I were to take that hand back from the front that had all of the birds and trees, I'd actually argue that this hand here is more representative of the diversity, of what makes up the diversity of life. And so microbes really dominate the diversity of life, and they actually become an excellent system for biological design. And we'll get into that in a minute, why that's the case. But I'd like to stop here in case anyone has any questions. They can throw them up. I see some other schools here. Illinois is here. Design School of Colding. RPI is here. I'm from Philadelphia, so go Eagles. Okay, so Allison and Dan asked, should we be thinking about ecosystems rather than individual species? And yes, actually, so if I were to suggest a core set of biology courses, if there were a biodesign major, for example, I would advocate, a general organismal biology class. So going in there, learning something about microbes, something about plants, something about animals, and just having a general understanding of organismal biology. But I would consider that a really foundational class. Really, I think it's more important when you're thinking about design to think about communities and ecosystems. So most of what we want to achieve with our designs is actually quite complex. And most of the complex problems that have been solved by life have been done in combination or are done at the level of a habitat or an ecosystem. And so understanding what it is that your design wants to achieve, where you anticipate your design existing. It can be an urban environment. I consider the urban landscape an ecosystem. So thinking about those parameters in your design of where this thing will be distributed and situated actually could be very key to helping you look at a particular ecosystem and start to understand who are the key players achieving a similar goal that my design is trying to achieve. You'll often find that really complex problems can only be solved by life. That's the power of biodesign. So I can make aspirin with chemicals, but I can't make advanced chemotherapies unless I have an organism make those medicines for me. And that's because the organism can fold things in certain ways that chemistry can't. And so, yes, I would say that ecosystems are important. Okay, so we all know, and I hope we all are appreciating that fabrication is changing, and it's changing across every single commercial sector. That's why it's so important to have something like the Biodesign Challenge to participate in as you guys are, in your educational careers and thinking about where you're going to go forward. And so I often ask, like, who will the future biologists be? And I think future biologists will still very much sit in the fields of medicine and still sit in research. But there's this huge opportunity for students who are coming in, who are taking life sciences, to not think about those careers at all, but instead to think about how a background in life sciences can be translated into fashion, for example, or into food, or into architecture, right? And that's because we can start to use organisms to fabricate or grow things for us. We obviously do this already. We grow our food. We grow medicines, for example. And so we're already used to this idea of leveraging organisms. We grow beer, we grow wine. I mean, we use these things, cheese, all of the things that we use on a day-to-day basis have at their core biology. This idea, though, that we can expand this into whole other markets is really awesome. I mean, I get really excited, probably too excited, as we kind of talk about this. But so fabrication is changing. This is great. There's a lot of benefits to using biology. It can be a more sustainable life cycle for a product. But really, one of the biggest reasons that I think biodesign is important is because we can actually program organisms to grow new things for us. Like I was saying before, that can only be done by life. That can't be done through chemistry alone. And so as we think about that, we think about genetic modification. We think about bringing together new communities. So not everything has to be a GMO when I'm talking about programming organisms. If you want to make a biopesticide, for example, or a biofertilizer, something that might stimulate a crop to produce more yield, you might actually think about putting together different populations with each other. And I consider that a level of programming. So not everything's genetic modification, but a lot of it is. And when we think about genetic modification, some of the easiest things to modify are microorganisms and plants. And we can genetically modify animals as well, but that opens up a whole new debate. People tend to ethically be more comfortable with the genetic modification of the single-celled microorganisms. And I encourage you to debate this, both sides of that argument in your classrooms. So I alluded to the fact, stated very clearly that the bioeconomy, that biofabrication is changing. And so that means our entire economy is changing. And so on the left-hand side here, I have all the places where biology is being used. Some of this you may have covered in class already. So biosensors, for example. This could be, getting an organism to produce an antibody, and you embed that antibody in a wearable, and then some product that's being produced in the sweat of an individual can activate that sensor. And so people are thinking about this, for example, for passive detection of glucose levels for diabetics, so that they don't have to stick themselves all the time. We had a group who thought about this last year for measuring the onset of mania in bipolar patients. And there's a lot of work happening in this space in medical devices with engineers and doctors. But there is not as much of a connect there between how those innovations can be translated into everyday wearables or into our clothing or into sports performance apparel, for example. So we may completely change our athleisure wear and be really aware of how our bodies are responding at all times. Flavors, fragrances, active coatings, data storage, right? We can actually store a whole bunch of information in organisms, and so that opens up all kinds of possibilities. You can actually use organisms, and they're used, microorganisms in particular are used to mine gold as a way of getting at these raw materials. So it's everywhere. The bioeconomy is everywhere. And our goal in the Biodesign Challenge is to think about how to use biology in design, right? And so I'm not a designer. I am not an engineer. I am just a very curious person who has worked hard to have a job where I just get to ask, questions and try to find out the answers. And that's one of the reasons I love being in science. That kind of intellectual curiosity is really valued. But in teaching, co-teaching design, I've come to appreciate some of the things that you guys think about when you're designing products or designing artifacts or even working on bioart projects. And so form and function obviously are major considerations in design. The cost of the final product is a consideration in the design. The life cycle of the product. Will it be cradle to cradle? Will it be cradle to grave? Who will handle this object from its inception all the way to its use? What does the supply chain look like around this object? Where are the raw materials being sourced from? Where is this product being manufactured? And then thinking about the ethics of the design as well. And so I encourage you guys right now to throw up some other things that you consider when you are designing. And I'm not talking about biodesign. We're going to get to that in a minute, the additional things that you might need to think about. But in design, what are some other things that you think about? Great. Users, need. Yes. These are all great things. Users, in my experience with the Biodesign Challenge, sometimes users are thought of at the end. And I would encourage you to put users right up there in the front. Need is absolutely one of the drivers of why we would design something. Great. So I encourage you to keep thinking of these things, ecosystem of other products out there, right? So where will your design fit in? Is there a need to change the infrastructure around this design as well? So is this design driving certain behaviors or driving certain decisions that have much larger impacts? Breaking down cultural expectations is also a great consideration in design. One of the things I love about biodesign is the ability to kind of reimagine who participates in product design and reimagine how we think about the end consumer in our design. Okay, so when we consider biodesign, what Orkan and I do is we do this as an activity with students in the classroom where we have them write down all of the things that they would consider in design, just like you guys did, as well as some of the things that we think about. And then we think about, okay, if we're going to solve a problem through design, or we're going to generate a response to something through design, and we decide that biology is going to add an element to it that this design could not be realized without it. Okay, so if the design can be realized without the biology, you might want to question why you're bringing the biology in the first place. But if it really is going to rely very critically on the biology, then as you're designing, you need to think about, okay, which organism am I going to select to achieve my end goal? And so again, ethics is going to be part of this. So if you want to tell me that you want to genetically modify human embryos as part of your design, we're probably going to have a healthy debate around that. But if you're telling me that you're going to take, a cloning strain of E. coli and modify it where there aren't as many safety concerns, then we can have maybe a different conversation about what the ethics are. Though I still think there's a very vibrant discussion to have around that. If we're going to put something living into our design, how are we going to care for that? How are we going to ensure that it grows? What rate do we want it to grow at? Do we want it to stop growing at some point? Do we want this to be a permanent design or a transient design? If we want to kill our design, how are we going to kill it? And then when we kill it, what are the implications of that design existing out in the world? Does it need to be taken away, or can it stay there and decompose over time? Can that death of the design actually be part of the design? Can it actually drive what it is that we want the design to do? If we want our organisms to do specific things in the design, or we want the design to respond to some stimuli in some way, how are we actually going to induce that biological function? Are we going to allow the design to have agency over itself in response, or do we want that to be tightly controlled and only respond under certain conditions and have that control be managed in a way that only human intervention can induce that biological function? So for example, do we want to make our organism tethered to some stimulus that's artificial, that it can't get in nature? So maybe we want to make a synthetic amino acid, for example, that it can only function when we provide that in the design. Then we want to think about safety and containment, right? So are people going to be touching this organism? Can this organism get out and move around? Does this organism need to be contained? If we're going to put it out into the environment where we have natural, storms come in or have different events that we can't predict, how do we deal with containment? What does our engineering look like around this design being implemented in our current infrastructure? And so these are things I think about when students are bringing me design, but I know you guys have had some opportunity to think about your biodesign. So I encourage you to throw up some other things that you guys think about as you're designing with biology. And I'll read them as we go. I can keep going so that we can have enough time here for the webinar. Okay, so one of the practices we do in biodesign, and this is a new thing that I've done because when I was teaching biodesign in the beginning, we would get really excited about the designs that were being proposed. And we would get really excited about how they could change the world. And, you know, this new product was going to go in and it was going to take off and everybody was going to see the value of it. And it was just going to go gangbusters. But I noticed that there was a very narrow view that was happening around the design as to the problem it was trying to solve, but then not necessarily paying attention to the larger world in which this design was going to exist. So I started talking about it with some of my science friends, and it was a great conversation with my buddy in the veterinary school, we were talking about how vets have a problem with how doctors think about human health, human medical doctors think about human health, and how narrow the vision is about, you know, the human and its health, but not thinking about the environment in which the human exists. And so I really kind of started probing my friend and saying, well, what do you guys do when you think about animal health? And he said that they really step back and take a model. It's called the One Health model. So maybe you guys know this, but it's a model used in veterinary medicine and veterinary education that human welfare is tied to animal welfare and environmental welfare. And environmental welfare is tied to animal health and human health. Animal health is tied to human health and environmental health. So basically, if we make a change in our environment, that can have negative or positive consequences for animals and humans. And we can do this for any of the sectors that are shown. And so when we do a design now, we step back and we say, okay, let's list the pros and cons of this design on human health, animal health, and environmental health. And then let's look at who the stakeholders are around those pros and cons. So if we have some design that's really going to drive up access to more people, and so we can say, okay, this is great, this is going to democratize some advancement and more people are going to receive the benefit, there is clearly a stakeholder group there. But is there some stakeholder that our design is going to significantly disrupt, who then might have power to intervene to suppress our design, right? And might we think about that as we think about how this design might be adopted in the marketplace? Or we'll do things like we're going to modify the environment in some way, and we know that this is going to have a positive impact for water quality, but could it be having a detrimental impact to some other habitat that we hadn't thought about? And so we kind of take this process of proposing the design, overlaying the One Health model and going around the map, doing pros and cons and laying out those stakeholders. And then, this is the key, we hand it to audiences that have that look nothing like me, that have no experience like me, come from a very different background, and ask them to perform the same exercise. So I might, for example, hand this off, if I'm just thinking about this professionally, I might hand off this design and my stakeholder pro-con chart off to somebody in the art world so that I get a unique perspective on what I'm bringing to the table as a scientist, as an environmental scientist, and my training, because there's certainly blinders in the process of how I'm interpreting this design. And so we're going to go through this. We're going to do this case study today and see how it goes. So that's the One Health model. Okay, so we're going to move on to a case study, but I wanted to just make sure you guys had a chance to breathe and digest what I've said. People have been chiming in on other things for biological design. So what are the properties of life that make it especially useful solution? So the fact that the design could replicate or adapt or evolve. And evolution of a design is often seen as a negative part of the design, but that actually could be leveraged for the good. Mark is chiming in and saying that complex molecular reactions and metabolisms have to be considered in the design. We can absolutely oversimplify the organism's need, especially as we're just entering into using life sciences in design. And so it may seem like this should work perfectly. And then you find out in your design, like that genetic pathway required this precursor in order for me to see this outcome. And so now I have to go back and rethink my entire design. But that's okay. That's part of the design process. And that's actually part of the scientific process as well. So Hunter put in a great one about how biological organisms can roam in their mediums, and starting to think about how computer programs can roam in the digital world and how people roam in our built environment. So actually, I didn't talk about dispersal or migration or movement. And that's actually really a very, very cool part about life, is this ability to disperse and to have the design go further than you might be able to otherwise. And so I think these are all great things to think about. Okay, so what I want to do is walk us through a process of creating a biodesign, if you were sitting in my class, and how we might go about this. So I hope everybody's game for it. Okay, so there are a lot of problems facing us, some more pressing than others. One of the biggest is food security and undernourishment. So estimates are that by 2050, we will not have enough food on this planet to feed the world's population. And there's something like 12 species of plants that stand between us and starvation. And I'm happy to share on, after this what those 12 species are, but they're things like sugar, cane, wheat, tapioca. And so these form the basis of what we eat and what our food supply looks like. So we're running out of land to grow food. Our climate is changing. The world's population is getting larger, and soil is eroding like crazy. And so we have major problems to solve, and we don't have a lot of time to do this. So people have really been thinking about how do we address things, how do we address these issues? And they actually are different based on which part of the world you're in. So here in America, one of our biggest things is not necessarily quantity of food, though if you look across the US, there are definitely areas in urban environments in particular where food access is not plentiful. But when we look at kind of this Western problem, it's undernourishment. So it's having access to a lot of food, but not a lot of food that's of high quality nutritionally. In other parts of the world, it's not having enough food. And so we need to change something, and we need to change something really fast. So this would be a great place to start thinking about biodesign. And people are. So there are a lot of game-changing startups that are in this space of food. And we're not just talking about how you boost crop yields of existing plants. They're thinking about brand new ways of making food. So seeking alternative proteins. And, Tyson, who makes chicken nuggets and chicken patties, I know because I buy them. I have young kids. They're ripe for disruption. Chicken farming is hard to do. And it can be really damaging to the environment. And so there's a whole bunch of companies thinking about alternative proteins. Some are targeting food waste. Some are thinking of increasing farm productivity for either the animals and plants that we rely on already. Some are thinking about how we grow food in brand new environments. So vertical farming, for example, how can you leverage all of this indoor space we have to do vertical farming? Can you farm in the bottom of the ocean? I had a biodesign group that proposed that using methane outgassing, which was a pretty cool project. And then also thinking about bioengineering brand new food sources that might not yet exist. And so this is a great area. I'm really heartened and optimistic seeing these startups and seeing people think about, new dairy substitutes, new egg substitutes, new types of drinkable meals. But I want to caution you as you go into the Biodesign Challenge that these startups have been at it for a long time. It's hard to go from idea to adoption. And there's a lot of steps in that process, though I do think being tethered to a big problem that really needs to be solved is very motivational as you're designing. And we're not just talking about food security and undernourishment, we're even thinking about like new types of flavors. We can do that with bioengineering and biodesign, or probiotic food supplements. If we're not out, digging in the dirt every day and getting the soil microbiome that we need, maybe we can bring that in other products that we have, especially if kids are really detrimentally impacted by not having access to these outdoor resources. How about allergy-free foods? The allergy-free peanut will be a hit. I will be a big purchaser of that when that's available. So let's imagine that you're in the Biodesign Challenge and you decide that you want to think about something related to the food cycle, the supply chain around food, so that you can make a positive impact with your design. And so you decide that you want to change how things are grown, and you want to use microbes because microbes form the basis of so much of our food supply chain. They're either necessary in the soil for when we're growing plants, they're necessary for a healthy microbiome associated with the meat we eat. They're used in all kinds of fermentation practices. So you decide that you want to do something with microbes, and you start looking around. You might be in an urban environment like Philadelphia, and you think, okay, I don't have a lot of arable land in which to work out this problem, but I do have a very big restaurant scene. And so I know that chefs want to do local flavors. I also know that chefs need to innovate all the time to stay relevant and continue to bring customers to their restaurants. And I've also observed, kind of walking around, that some restaurants are converting into vertical farming. So I'm making these observations and I decide maybe there's something I can do with restaurants to help them out so that they can be more efficient in how they use food, and reduce waste, and actually, generate some new product that would be of value to this user group. And so the first thing I would do is I'd actually go around to restaurants and start talking to chefs and understanding, where their needs are. So if they already have a vertical farm in their building like this, they don't need me to come in and design something for their vertical farm. Maybe they need this to be more efficient, and so maybe I can contribute there. But maybe it's really that at the end of the day, they have a lot of food that is wasted in the preparation. They're cutting away parts of vegetables that they're not going to use. They're breaking open eggs, and the eggshells are somewhere. And they really want to compost that material because they would like to have an on-site source for soil. They don't want to go out and extract this soil from the environment because they know that soil erosion and soil degradation is a big problem. And if they can generate soil in-house from their food waste, that would be awesome. And so you kind of just start these interviews, and okay, composting is not hard. There's nothing big here associated with composting. But if we look at composting, we might look at something like this, where we're talking about a traditional system that sits outside. It's a box. It has holes in it. You put water in it. You put organic waste in there of green and brown layers. You can see to the left that I have plenty of food scraps that would be available for this compost. And in doing my research, I noticed that there are companies out there who are already thinking about how you adapt compost for indoor spaces. And so, you might be like, well, why don't I just make a compost that sits outside the restaurant? I mean, composts smell and they take up a good size. Why do I want to bring it inside? And so you start to think about that question. So why might these restaurants want to bring their compost inside the restaurant? So bye, Mark, see you later. So if you don't compost, or you haven't composted before, one of the things you have to be concerned about are rats. So you need to think about rodents. in your compost? Do you have food waste here? And so that's going to, give off good smells for organisms to come and try to get into your compost. And we don't necessarily want those organisms hanging around our restaurants, right? So we might want to bring them inside. Certainly, we want to still think about the fact that these rodents can be inside our buildings, and so we want to design them in this way that they can sit inside. But also, too, if I'm a chef and I'm composting, I want this to be as easy as possible. I want my scraps that are on the counter to just be pushed right into my compost. That's how I'm going to get adoption of this product, right? So I want to think about that design. And so I start walking around the restaurants, and I realize very quickly that space is a premium in restaurants, and that whatever system I come up with is going to have to integrate into the existing infrastructure if I want it to be adopted. So I start looking at all these baker racks that are sitting in restaurants, and I say, okay, well, maybe if we took that green compost and instead we redid the geometry so the compost bins can hang on the side here, or they can be mounted underneath. So anywhere where there's wasted space. So, any tight corner that this could go into, or if it could hang from the ceiling, all of this would be really advantageous because we'd be just taking up space that's not being used. We want it to have this minimal footprint. We definitely want it to be modular because the kitchen setup's going to change over time. The restaurant will maybe periodically shift these racks around or start using a different area. And so we want it to be modular so that it's portable, but we also want to grow the system over time if the restaurant grows. We really want easy access for removing the compost in its solid form or as a tea. So what this compost is going to be used for is going to be used to grow the plants that are already in their vertical garden, whether that vertical garden is happening inside the restaurant or outside of the restaurant. And we can either use the soil itself, or we can leach out the carbon. We can pour water over top of that soil and then use that to sprinkle onto our plants. So we can get a lot of bang for our buck by producing this soil. If they produce a really large amount of soil that they can't use for their own compost, they can start to sell that soil, right? So then that's another revenue stream for these restaurants. And so we want it to contain all the elements of the traditional composter. It still needs that aeration. It still needs some compact areas where no oxygen is getting in so that we can get some anaerobic degradation. It needs water. And so we've got to think about all of those parameters just from the physical design of the project, of the compost. But this is a biological design challenge. So we want to add some elements to it that can only be achieved through biology. And so we want to do some inline sensing. Perhaps it's really important, and it is really important, for people to know the temperature of their compost, also the humidity associated with their compost. We could build some inline sensing in here that's done by organisms in the compost itself that can give us feedback. That feedback can be routed to a mobile app that somebody can check on. We can even hook our system up so that watering of the compost happens only when a certain humidity level or soil moisture level is detected. So we could make this a completely smart system. We could do this with electronics, but we can actually use organisms to do this for us, and we'll talk about how. And that's a really, really nice way to do sensing. It takes you completely off the grid, and it's actually responding to the organism's behavior, which is what you care about most in this system. We also want really efficient turnover of the material into soil and tea. So if we look at a compost right now, it could be a little bit too slow for what the restaurant's needs are. And it also doesn't necessarily degrade all of the organic matter that you're putting into the compost. So there's a good amount of material that just never gets broken down. We could look at the biology that's out there to understand if this could be a feedstock for organisms and how we might incorporate that into our design. And we want something that doesn't smell. Okay, we don't want this to be something that they add to the kitchen that makes it stink. So we have these things in front of us. It's a lot to design, but it's actually something that would be like a tractable problem, I think, for a biodesign challenge. So if I see like 15 compost designs this year submitted, Allison and Dan will probably wring my neck. But this is just a good way that we kind of go through this exercise. So where do we start? Well, first we start with research, then we move into design, build, test, and improve. And this whole process becomes a learning curve where as we go through this process, it drives us towards more research, and we just keep going around this circle. So you guys should be used to this, hopefully, in your course. And so when we talk about inline sensing, how many of you have heard of microbial fuel cells? You can raise your hand, I guess, or just type in yes. So microbial fuel cells are really cool because you can put very low powered devices, sensing devices on them. It's just a soil column. If you embed some carbon fiber down here and some carbon fiber on the top, most of you guys know this, you can generate an electrical current. So this is why microbes are so dope, because they can do all kinds of crazy things like produce electricity. And they're actually doing that, we think, because they need to communicate with one another in the environment. So it's a way of communication. Derek Lovely is a great person to follow on Twitter, who really is kind of a big name in microbial fuel cells. Anyway, long story short is our compost in some form or another is going to look like one of these soil columns. We're going to design it in a way where there's areas that are anaerobic and areas that are aerobic. So it's actually going to fit all the criteria, biological criteria that we need to incorporate it into our design. We have soil and organic matter. We have an oxygen gradient. We can certainly embed these materials into our compost and drive some kind of sensing mechanism that will report back to us. So great, that part of our design is solved. And as a first step, I would, go out and encourage the students to build one of these MFCs really quickly, not in their design, but just quickly at the bench so that they understand what the constraints are on the biology, so then they can incorporate that into the design. But the real thing is that we want to make a compost that's faster at turning over material, or can turn over material that isn't being traditionally digested in a compost. So this may be a little bit hard to see, but I have two different diagrams. On the left-hand side, I have a compost pile. This is really high level. So we're going to put in organic matter. We're going to put in minerals and water. The microorganisms are going to be in our soil unless we've sterilized it. Don't sterilize the soil for your compost. This is a takeaway. And it's going to give off water, carbon dioxide, and heat. We could actually, if we really want our compost to be smart, we could capture this carbon dioxide and drive some algal biofuel production if we wanted. So we could really get this whole system cranking. And it's going to put out all of this, all of these components over here, some of which are going to form our soil, but there's going to be other high value commodities in our soil that could be used in a totally different way. And so that's a really cool thing. As we look through who's doing the decomposition and when, we find that there's this group here, which is hard to see, lignin, so which is part of woody substrates, have largely not been transformed. So all the ingredients except for the woody substrates have not been transformed. So bingo. What if we design an organism that we embed in our compost that can degrade lignin? Seems easy enough, right? And so where do we go? Well, first we want to think about what features of the organism we want. So some considerations before we even do the research on what we could use is we want this organism to be easy to modify, because we're probably going to have to take the genes for lignin degradation from some other organism and put it into our organism, because we want this organism to be easy to grow and safe to handle. And so we hit PubMed. And this is where you might need to collaborate with one of your science friends or a scientist who can help you weed through the massive amounts of literature that are out there to solve your problem. Because your question's pretty straightforward. You want to understand who degrades lignin in a system, and can that function be transferred to another organism that's really easy to grow. And so we look and we find engineering the lignolytic enzyme consortia, which means that we're talking about communities of organisms. So that's super cool. They're looking at how you can get different organisms together to do this. And what they find is that Saccharomyces cerevisiae, or baker's yeast, has been consolidated as the best organism in which to evolve these genes. Well, that seems doable, right? We can start to work with that. And then we also just see, like, okay, has this organism been used in other ways to degrade lignin? And yes, it has. So you can genetically engineer the same organism, here it is, for biodiesel production. So we're thinking about lignin degradation in a compost pile, but these people are thinking about lignin degradation essentially in a compost pile, but in capturing the output, the CO2 effluent that comes out in that degradation, as well as some of the byproducts of that lignin degradation to make biodiesel fuel. And so this can send you down a rabbit hole. So I like to put some constraints on myself when I'm doing research. I like to define the space and the problem I'm really after. And when I find, a good enough set of resources, I usually, make myself stop. Otherwise, I'll just spend way too much time researching. So you read a couple of these papers and you're really excited because you know that you can genetically modify Saccharomyces cerevisiae. You can genetically modify it to break down lignin. And it also turns out that you can genetically modify it to make things smell good. So this is from the BioBuilder book, which is one of the resources you guys have. And here they're using E. coli to make a banana smell at a certain level of growth. But you can genetically modify Saccharomyces cerevisiae instead of E. coli, and there's advantages to why you might modify a yeast versus an E. coli, and you could weigh those out as you're considering your design. So very quickly, you guys have figured out two elements of your design that can only be solved with biology or can be best solved with biology. The first is that you can build a sensor into your system that can feed back to the user by taking advantage of the properties of a microbial fuel cell. And then you can genetically modify a yeast that you can put into your system that can degrade lignin and that can make the compost smell good. And the nice thing about this yeast is you could contain it in an apparatus that fits into your compost so that it doesn't escape into the surrounding soil if you're going to use that soil when you plant. So you can put membranes around this organism in the housing that lets all of the metabolites in, or even lets the lignin in, but then leaches out the products you need. So these might be things you'd think about. Okay, and then you're going to think about what it needs to grow, what nutrients need to be in there. Clearly lignin's going to need to be in there, but there's going to be other things that are going to need to be in there. And then you go back and look at your column here and you think about where you're going to place these things. And you see you're going to have woody debris or leaf material at the top. And then your veggies are going to be underneath there. And then you're going to have some more leaf detritus or lignin woody material down at the bottom here. And so you say, I'm not going to make my yeast do both things. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make one version of my yeast for the smell, and I'm going to put that at the top. And then I'm going to make another version of my yeast that can survive under these anaerobic conditions and do the lignin degradation, and I'm going to put that at my bottom. And these are just design decisions that you're making. There's no reason you can't do both of these together and put them in the same location. And in fact, you might try that out in your design as you're prototyping. But this is great. So you did your research, you figured out your design. Now you go to the bench and you build your compost in the form factor you want. You genetically modify your yeast. I don't want to give you the impression that this is really easy to do. In fact, it's not that easy to do, but you're have a problem in front of you and you're going to work with the right people to solve it. And you're going to build this system, and then you're going to start to compost food, and you're going to put leaves into this system. You're going to go out into your neighborhood if you have trees, or you might go into an urban park if you're in an urban system, and you're going to collect some woody material, some leaves and sticks, and you're going to put them in here, and you're going to test it. You're going to test if your sensor's giving you feedback. You're going to test if you're actually making soil. You're going to see if you can recover that organism back out of the soil. You're going to test all of these things, and you're going to find issues with your design that you're going to need to improve, and you're going to research, and you're going to continue this cycle over and over again. For the Biodesign Challenge, you might not get through many iterations of this prototyping, but there's aspects of the design that you could prototype very quickly, and other aspects that might be harder to do, but you've done enough research to prove that with enough resources and time, you can prototype it. Okay, and then you go through this great exercise of, looking at the impacts of your design more globally. So if you start composting at the local scale with these organisms, what's the impact on animal health and environmental health? So I think we could all argue that this would have great impacts on environmental health, right? We'd be reducing the amount of food that's going into landfills. We'd be really going cradle to cradle with the food that's being used in the cooking process. We'd be supporting this whole diversity of microbes that could be used to make other commodities that could be, become its own form of e-commerce. And we know that growing more vegetables and not shipping these things around over long distances, using a lot of carbon to do that, whether by shipping them on, boats or planes or trucks, would be good for human health because the environment would be better, so on and so forth. So this is a great design, right? Are we all in agreement? Cool. Some of you say cool, yes. Maybe nobody will disagree with me at this point. Somebody could say this is a horrible design. We can't do this. And that's what you want. You want some debate around the pros and cons. Right, so how are we going to kill the yeast at the end of it? Yeah, we haven't gotten to that part, Kathy. So we're going to need to think about that in the design. And that's why you want to do this exercise, because I would hope that somebody would think about, what the implications would be if, I don't know, somebody who's not really thinking about it when they're using the compost actually transmits this, material out into the restaurant, for example. Is there a problem with that if this yeast gets out? That's something we would want to debate, right? How would you get the lignin into the yeast compartment? It's woody pieces, not liquid, right? So if we want to contain the yeast in a contraption, how are we going to actually do this? So these are all good things that at first pass look simple, and then as we dig into them, it's going to get harder. Not unsolvable, just harder. And so going through the process and starting at a high level and then coming back and dealing with all these complications as we go is part of the design process. And I see it as an opportunity, not as a hindrance. And I think sometimes when we enter into these challenges, we get overwhelmed with the biological demands if we haven't spent a lot of time with biology, that we almost get frozen in the ability to even start prototyping. And I really encourage students to, release yourself of this need to be an expert. This is a problem-solving activity. You will learn as you go. And if you surround yourself with experts in different fields, so scientists, chefs, designers, you'll start to iterate through and solve those problems much, much faster. You do not need to be an expert at all things. You need to have a good community around you that can advise you. Okay, so let's imagine that you solve all of these problems, especially Eugene's problem of how we're actually going to get the lignin in with the yeast, but keep the yeast separate from our soil, right? This is a real engineering and design challenge. But let's say we solve this. A bunch of restaurants adopt it. They love it. People are eating in the restaurant. It actually becomes a feature within the restaurant to attract customers. Customers decide they want this for their homes. So now there's a whole other market that's adopting this design. And it's just wildly successful. We are dramatically reducing the amount of food waste that's going into landfills. And actually, one of the biggest things we're doing is we're generating soil. We need soil. We desperately need soil globally. And so this is great. We're generating a ton of soil. Whether people are using it in their home gardens or whether they're actually selling it, bears to be seen with the design, but it's really, really successful. So we decide that this is exciting and that we solved a major problem and we're seeing mass market adoption. And so there's nothing wrong with this, right? Okay. There is. So one of the big aspects of our design is that we have designed an organism that breaks down woody material and leaves. And so at some point, we're going to have to find that feedstock. And so when I go out, I live in a part of Philadelphia where this very much looks like my backyard. Okay, so I really love where I live. It's very wooded. Philadelphia has a deep commitment to keeping forested areas within the region. So I could go out and very easily generate enough leaves on my property in a year to support my compost. Actually, I could generate an excess of leaves. So if you're in a different part of the city and you need access to leaves, I could actually sell you some of my leaves or donate them to you. And say you're living in, New York City and you don't you have Central Park, you have other areas where you might be able to get this woody material, but actually what you have north of you is the Cascades, and it's very rural. And you could imagine that people could see this as an economy to sell woody debris for all of this composting. And so you'd have a whole new kind of company that springs up around this leaf material. And at first glance, the municipalities aren't against this because the municipalities end up spending a lot of money to remove a lot of this woody debris when it falls on streets, and they end up bringing it into their areas for composting, but maybe even the cities start selling it out, right? So anyway, this becomes a commodity. Woody debris becomes a commodity. Okay, the problem with taking woody debris out of the environment is that woody debris is actually really important for aquatic ecosystems. So leaves fall, at least in temperate regions. So leaves fall into streams, and they are a very, very important carbon source for the organisms that live there. And so what happens is we call this dissolved organic matter. So some of the leaves fall directly into our waterways, but a lot of our leaves go into the soil and become litter. And they get decomposed by the fungus and the bacteria that live in these soil columns. So it's an important source of organic matter for the soil communities, and it's really important for keeping those soil, for one, keeping the soil building up over time, but also keeping that soil really healthy for the surrounding trees. The other thing is when it rains, that soil, that carbon that's being decomposed in this litter, if it's not eaten up right away or sucked up by the root exudates, when it rains, it can actually be pulsed out into the surrounding body of water. So the rain comes through, it percolates down, the soil becomes waterlogged, and the water gets pushed out into the stream, and it carries the carbon along with it. So this becomes a really important source of carbon for the surrounding water communities. And so these are two figures here. This one here is on the left-hand side is called the river continuum concept, where woody debris and carbon come into the system at the top. They're eaten by invertebrates and shredders. They're also eaten by the organisms, microbes that live on the bottom of the stream. The products that come out of those metabolisms help to feed and create vital nutrients for the phytoplankton, the photosynthesizers in the stream. And so we have this cycle of carbon that's moving down the stream. Those invertebrates are an important source for the fish in the stream. And so all of these organisms are linked to each other, and they're all linked to each other by how carbon is being cycled in its various forms through the system. Even fish, like salmon, for example, will use the organic matter signatures, so the carbon signature that's coming from the leaves and the soil in that habitat, as a way to navigate back to where they should spawn when it's time for them to reproduce. So these organic matter signatures are really, really important. The organic matter is important for supporting the diversity of life in the stream, and it's also an important sensing molecule for some of the migrating organisms within this stream. And so if we look down here, organic matter that's coming from leaves and coming from plants is really important. Here it is when it's dissolved, as well as being a direct source of food for invertebrates. Okay, so we can start to see where if we start to pull this commodity out in large demand, because of the fact that we have a product that relies on woody material and leaf material, yes, we're solving a problem with food scraps, but we may be creating a whole different problem for fresh water. And so this is a big deal. When you look at the quality of water sources, so in Philadelphia, we have two rivers, the Schuylkill, over here, and the Delaware, that form our source for drinking water. In New York, you guys are pretty cool because you've bought up the entire watershed and protected it so that I think you're the largest body of water that is unfiltered for a city. So that's, or is only filtered. Sorry, in Philadelphia, we treat it with chlorine and other disinfectants. You guys pass it through a filter. You guys can type in where your source rivers are, if you know them, in this box here. And if you don't know them, I encourage you to log on to Google and type in where you live and figure out where your water is coming from. If it's coming from a well, for example, then your water quality is definitely tied to the soil around you. But the idea here is that, nice, Sacramento River and well water. I was thinking Micah might be on here, so I was looking up Baltimore. It's a little bit harder. Colorado River, Owens Valley, deep wells. RPI, where does your water come from? Might be putting you on the spot. But the idea here is that if we change the carbon cycling in our source waters and we start to have a decrease in the diversity of organisms, and then that impacts higher organisms in the food chain within our aquatic ecosystems, we're going to create all kinds of problems for the quality of our drinking water. So yes, we may have solved a problem with our composting system that has a huge impact on our day-to-day lives, but we may also have created a totally different problem for something that's just as vital, which is our water supply. And so really the only way that we might have foreseen this challenge would be to go through the exercise of designing this system and then applying the One Health model, and starting to think about where are our feedstocks coming from? What are the organisms that we're now going to be growing in abundance? How many people are going to start to use our design so that we have an idea of like the scale that our feedstocks are going to need to be at, or the scale that our organisms going to need to be grown at? Where else does that fit into our environment? Where else does that fit into our economy, into our supply chain? If our design is really successful, what is the major impact when that design is realized at scale? And that doesn't mean that this was a fruitless exercise. In fact, this means that we're onto a good idea, but that we've thought farther into the future about the impact of our design. And so at BioFabricate this year, which is one of the good conferences to go to for biodesign, there was a scientist there from NASA who was saying that NASA actually really welcomes biodesigners to talk to them because they can really help you think about these much bigger impacts that you can be blinded to. So in this exercise, if we had not handed off this design and this One Health model to evaluate the stakeholders to a stream ecologist or an environmental scientist, we may have missed this impact of sourcing woody debris from our design. And so that's really, a huge opportunity as you guys are working on your designs. So I talked longer than I thought I was going to. I hope I generated some good ideas as you guys are thinking about design. And I welcome any questions you have and to continue the conversation, or if you guys are working on your designs for the Biodesign Challenge. We do not have a team participating this year. I have a lot of scientist friends. I might not evaluate the design. I think that'd probably be against the rules at this point. But I have a lot of scientist friends who are generally willing to help. The last thing I want to say is if you're not connected to scientists, it can seem really scary getting in touch with them for their advice. But they, for the most part, love giving feedback on this kind of stuff. It's a really different way of thinking about the work they do. So as you're reading scientific publications and doing your research, in the primary literature and the literature you're reading, there'll often be a corresponding author listed. And that's the person that you can email about the paper you're reading as a way to get some feedback on your design. And, some people won't be receptive, but others will usually give you, 15 minutes on a Skype call to help you think about your design.
So we're going to, well, first of all, thank you,
Thank
Karen.
you, Karen. That was wonderful.
So I recommend to everyone to watch the chat and voice your applause.
Yes.
However you do that. We're still figuring that out. And then why don't we start throwing some questions up on the chat window as well. Karen, that was a lot of information and really helpful. There are two things that I wanted to address. One is it becomes clear that anything at scale, at massive scale, taken to the extreme, seems to be damaging to an environment. Like we're talking about creating a balance here.
Mm-hmm.
When you imagine things at scale, balance becomes so much of a problem. Can you talk a little bit about that, and then we'll go on to the next question.
Yeah, I mean, so my training is as a community ecologist. So we actually don't look at it as problematic, but more through the lens of trade-offs. So, and that's why I think that stakeholder exercise can be really useful, because there's definitely going to be disadvantages to any implementation at large scale. It just, the design that wins out is the one where you feel that the trade-off is least damaging. And so, for example, if food security, like I actually would think I wouldn't go forward with this design because I think that water quality is more important than food security in the short term. Well, in any case, because natural water, clean water is such a more finite resource, and we don't have good ways of making it. We don't have good ways of remediating it once it's polluted. And I really can see some major geopolitical consequences to the scarcity of water. I mean, we already see them exist, right? And in the US, Edinburgh, I'm not sure how it is there, but in the US, we're already seeing privatization of water. In Texas, for example, in the southeast US. So if you're not aware of that, a good documentary is Blue Gold around that. So for me, this exercise would say, okay, let's back up. And if the major problem with the design is the feedstock, if that's what's going to have the impact on water quality, and I think that water quality is the bigger thing to save, then now what I'm going to start to research is there other feedstock I could use? So maybe lignin degradation isn't the right thing to go after. Maybe I could start looking at plastic, for example. And actually, I think that's one of the biggest problems facing biodesign at scale is feedstock. We're used to using certain raw commodities for manufacturing, and we're going to really have to rethink what those raw commodities are as our nutrient source.
I'm going to ask another question, which is how do we know, or how do we decide when biology is the right way to go, rather than, let's say, a mechanical solution or a digital solution or some other, maybe chemistry solution? When does biology become?
So the question for those that couldn't hear it was, when is biology the right solution versus something mechanical or chemical? First, I think that biology has to be integral to the design. If it can be solved some other way, I'm not really sure why biology is being incorporated, except that it might be innovative, it might be new. And so there's certainly some flashy examples of biodesign that could have very easily been solved or more efficiently solved with electronics, for example. But biology is dynamic, and I think that's actually one of the biggest benefits of designing with biology. So you have a system that can respond in real time and respond in ways that other systems can't, right? So, and it can respond at, gradients. You can have a fluctuation in the response. So that ability to respond to a stimuli and produce some function can be done multiple ways, but can in complex ways be done with biology. And then there's just certain things that only biology can do or can only do well. So folding of proteins, of complex proteins, that has to be done in cell systems. We don't have a good way of doing that outside of cells. We don't really understand how cells do it in the first place. I mean, we understand a lot of the process, but we don't understand all of the process. So those kind of traits that are unique to biology are when biology becomes compelling in the design. But I do look at designs and say, could you have just solved this with electronics? Or could you have just solved this by, mixing this thing up like you're suggesting? If the answer is yes, I would hope that that would bear out in that, in this constant feedback on your design. You need some people who are lovingly critical about your design. Christina says that designing with biology may also radically alter the life cycle overall. Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's elements of designing with biology that I think are going to need to create like a fundamental shift in perspective that not everything can be under our control. Although we live under a falsehood anyway that everything's under our control.
Right. I think the same could be said for, asking for behavioral change instead of, let's say, a technical solution.
Right.
So, right, I always think about cigarette smoke and smoking in general. Right, there are technical solutions to the cancer and the emphysema that you get from smoking, but probably an easier solution would be the behavioral change. And if you look at the last 15 years of rates of smoking, it seems that is a much more functional solution than some of the other solutions that have been used in the past. Again, the chat box is open to questions. We have about 5 minutes left, and I see that a couple of people are typing away. Is there, so much of what we hear about industry is that it's heat, beat, and treat, right? The only way to make our products is either you use massive amounts of heat, you use mechanical force, or you treat it with some sort of chemical, all of which are high energy, some of them are caustic. The promise of biology is that you never get, things grow at room temperature. You don't have to treat them. You don't have to sort of force them with mechanical force into a specific shape. They grow to shape. How does that fit into the sort of imaginary when we talk about biology?
I mean, fundamentally, I think you hear a lot of people who are working with biodesign now professionally. The entire infrastructure has to change if we're going to be using biodesign for manufacturing. So I think about it a little bit like the new DuPonts of the world. So the new industrial manufacturers of the world are actually going to look like our beer companies. So looking at how Anheuser-Busch produces beer at scale is somewhat of a good model as we think about some of the raw materials that we're going to have organisms produce for us at scale. But that's hard to do, and I don't know if a lot of people would argue that like Miller Lite is the highest quality beer, but it still, it still fits a scale solution. So one of the infrastructures that I look at most closely that I think may come to dominate as we move to biodesign, as we move to fermentation practices for a lot of what we're going to produce, is craft brew. So it's at about the right scale. When craft brew came out, people didn't think it was going to really be a competitor for these large scale breweries. But actually, when you look at the economics of it, it's highly competitive. So cosmetic companies already produce things at these scales. They don't need large quantities of it. So they looked like craft brew production. But I think fashion is actually one of the biggest areas that's going to need to see that overhaul and infrastructure, because we can't yet produce the raw materials we need to meet the demand for new clothes at the cycle that we like it at, unless we really reimagine the manufacturing process. I don't know if that answers your question. I think it's doable. I think it's going to need some real visionaries to drive it forward. I think we're going to see a major infrastructure overhaul.
Right. I think some of them might be on this call.
Hi.
Hopefully. I wanted to ask a little bit about careers in biodesign since we're all here. Where do you think the kind of the job market is going for a designer or an artist or some of the other professions that we have in this chat session? How are they going to integrate with biotechnology, or vice versa? How is biotech?
So, I mean, the short answer is that any commercial sector that isn't going to adopt biotechnology, whether it's electronics, whether it's food, whether it's cosmetics or fashion, is going to be left behind. It's just, there's no way. The bioeconomy is growing so fast, and the value of producing materials this way both from a sustainability perspective as well as a novelty perspective, is just, you're either going to, you can bemoan progress or you can get on board. So that's kind of the first takeaway. So if you're looking for careers, to me, the companies that have been the most interesting are those that have a deep history of R&D, that have a real eye towards sustainability. And so some of cosmetics in particular can get a bad rep because, it seems like it's vain. This is makeup. Why do we care so much? But actually, some of those companies are the ones who really are at the forefront of connecting researchers, so scientists who are generating knowledge, with designers who develop products for adoption, and doing it in a way that doesn't leave such a big footprint. And so I think if you're looking for those types of organizations, that's one of the best ways to get in. I do think that this is a brand new profession. And I think that all of these students that we work with who are on this webinar, as well as the ones that we teach globally, it's a new career that's emerging. And I think they're going to help really set what that career is going to look like. It's a generation that you guys are used to breaking down silos. You don't see the same barriers that some of us have seen who've been in here a little bit longer. If I were coming back through this cycle, I wouldn't have a Ph.D. in environmental microbiology. I'd have a strong background in environmental microbiology, but I probably would have ended up in a design school. And so I think seeing that there seems to be a group of people who really want to merge life sciences with design, with development of applications, who see the value of engineering, but also see the value of design that are emerging. And it's really exciting. It's really hopeful.
So I think we're going to ask one last question, and this is from Mike from RPI. And I guess he asks, how do you design for the challenge considering all the IP issues and the patents that are out there? So how do you navigate the patent tangle, the bramble of patents?
So I don't worry about it. No, I mean, I know that's not the right answer, right? So yes, you need freedom to operate with your design. But that wouldn't be the first thing I would worry about in my design. It would be a consideration in my design. So as you're going through the design process, as we're saying, like the stakeholder element, that actually would be a good thing. And Mike, thank you. I think that this would probably be something I'll add in as we think about it. Like, what are the legal ramifications of your design? And that's actually why this is also where I see life sciences being so broadly adopted. I mean, becoming scientifically literate here in this field is even going to be important for the legal profession. It is important for the legal profession. So I don't have a good answer for you, Mike, yet, but I think but let me think on that. I'd like to get back to you. One of the things we do for our students, I should say, one of the things we do for our students is if students design something in our course, at least at the University of Pennsylvania, they own the IP. The university doesn't own any of the IP. As a faculty or staff member, it's totally different. And so we give full ownership of the project to the students. And so if they land on something that looks really promising, we just connect them with our tech transfer office so that they can explore the IP. And actually, at all of these universities, now I think I might be able to answer this question. At all of these universities, you should have a tech transfer office that specifically works on IP. You may not necessarily want to bring the students there, but usually you can talk to these people a bit freely without giving away too much information about what the legal implications would be surrounding a particular design.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Karen. This has been fantastic. I love that you brought us all through this case study, which I feel like is so important to see design from the beginning to end. Mm-hmm. And, as a student, designing for the first time with bio design, wondering how will I be able to see those, potential environmental implications. And it's so important to, contact different experts from different fields. And like you mentioned, I can't count the amount of times that I, really liked, someone's research on a paper and just reached out and asked So that's such an important resource that I feel like people don't really think about doing. Yes.
You're welcome. Actually, I will share with you guys and you can disseminate it to all the schools. I help my students with a little bit of like a form factor email so that they actually get a response. Short and sweet will usually get you a good response.
Right, and don't forget, you know, the Biodesign Challenge staff is here to help you as you progress with your projects.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
You know, feel free to reach out.
It's really nice to meet everybody virtually on the chat, and I hope to meet you face to face at the Biodesign Challenge.
Looking forward to it. It's coming up June 21st and 22nd.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us. And,
bye everyone.
Hopefully we'll be seeing you soon.